Everybody give it up for the youth band. That was awesome. Maybe you know, maybe you don't, but every Sunday night, the youth group meets down in the basement. There's a lot of awesome leaders who invest in those kids every single week. But a lot of that stuff goes unseen and unnoticed by you because you're not a teenager. And so I just want to also just call out greatness in Tobin, the amount of work he's put into building that team and discipling those kids. And Tobin's a blessing to our church. And it's awesome. Thank you, youth. It was great. So my name's Kinnon, and I get to be the pastor here. And this morning, we're kicking off a few different things. First, we're beginning our study through the book of Luke. At Citylight, we like to preach through books of the Bible, so we'll grab a book and just preach straight through it. And this book is going to be special because it's going to be the longest study we've ever done. Previously, the longest study we've done was Genesis, and that took us just a little under 6 months. But my hope for this study through the book of Luke is to slow down and to take an extended look at Jesus. And that's going to take us through 2026 and beyond, likely to 2028. We're not skipping a single thing. We're going to look at every single word Jesus ever said, every single miracle he did. We're going to really slow down and look at Jesus for the next 2+ years probably. I mean, I think that's a beautiful thing because it's in studying the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus for these coming months, we're going to saturate ourselves in Jesus. I'm getting the picture of like a marinade. There's a difference between like sprinkling a season on something and kind of coating it so the outside tastes like the thing. And actually, a lot of you probably brined turkeys this week. And if you didn't, you're a monster. Like turkey is not a good food. You got to do what you can to make it edible. And so you brined it. And so the hope was that all that, the moisture and the flavors like sunk down deep into the turkey. And my prayer is that as we saturate ourselves in the book of Luke is that Christ himself would actually begin to sink down into our very souls, that we wouldn't just be coated with a seasoning of Jesus, but it would actually from our very core, that we would begin to taste like Jesus, if you want to say it that way, which I don't know if I really want to say it that way, but I did anyway. So we're just going to slowly marinate ourselves in the book of Luke for the coming months, and it's going to be a beautiful, beautiful thing. So that's the process we're starting this week. But furthermore, this week is also the start of the season of Advent. Advent is the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, and Advent literally means either coming or arrival. And historically, Advent is a season where the church anticipates the coming of Jesus on Christmas. And that attitude that we come into during the season of Advent is an attitude of anticipation and of waiting. Just as the first century Jews were awaiting for their Messiah to come, we are invited to come wait alongside them, that knowing in future, knowing that Jesus did actually come during the first Advent, but there is a second Advent still to come where Jesus will return to make all things new. And honestly, our passage this morning is going to be great for us to talk through both of those beginnings this morning. First, we're going to get the book of Luke kind of kick-started, and then we're going to talk about God breaking into a waiting world. So let's open up our passage to the verses that Catalina read for us. Chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty considering the things that you have been taught. So let's start with the book of Luke. It's called the Gospel of Luke. And what a gospel does is it outlines details of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And the author of this gospel is Luke, and he's a companion of Paul, and as well as he wrote the book of Acts. He was a first-person observer to many events in the book of Acts, but in his gospel, Luke, he's a second-hand reporter of sorts. He goes and he interviews and he compiles, he interviews witnesses, investigates the stories of Jesus, and writes them out in what he calls an orderly account. And the reason he does this is so that we would have certainty, that we would know that Jesus really is who he claimed to be. And that leads us to the audience in this book, Theophilus. Some wonder whether this is a Gentile man living in Antioch that Luke is writing to in order to quell his doubts. But when you actually break down what Theophilus means, it means friend of God or lover of God. So this very well might be written to a real person named Theophilus, but it could also be said to be written to the God lovers. For everyone in this room who loves God, is seeking after God, who wants to know Jesus, this book is written for you. And it's written that you might have certainty. It's written for you as sort of a warm blanket to wrap yourself up in, to have your spirit affirmed in the love of God, the goodness and beauty of Jesus' message, and the awesome news of the gospel. I mean, it's amazing to think that the God of the universe loves us and cares for us so much that he wrote us a book that we might have certainty. Because if you are anything like me, we all find ourselves in seasons of life where we have doubts, where we're asking the questions of like, man, when I'm praying, is anybody actually hearing me? Sometimes like you feel like God has forgotten about you. Back during the pandemic, Jordan and I watched one of the most powerful movies I've ever seen. It's a movie directed by Martin Scorsese called Silence. It's a movie about missionaries traveling to Japan in order to spread the gospel. And one priest goes to Japan and never returns, so a second priest, who's kind of our main character, goes to seek him out. It's well known that Japan is hostile to the gospel, and so our main character goes on a search mission to try to find this lost missionary. And while in Japan, I don't remember the character's name, but I do know Andrew Garfield played him. He's met with the brutality and the suffering of Japanese Christians as they are under persecution. One of the most heart-wrenching scenes of the movie is of the priest. He's hiding back in the tall grass and watching as 3 fellow Christians are tied to a cross in the ocean, slowly being drowned by the waves as the tide is rising. 2 of them died pretty quickly, but one of them lasted days on the cross. And the priest noted that there was just dead silence on the beach. All you could hear was the waves rolling in and rolling out until one day, clear as day, you could hear a hymn sung by the man who was being martyred right before he died. And this is where our main character begins to wrestle with this question. Why was it so silent on that beach? Like, where was God? Why had he not answered their cries for deliverance? Why had he not rescued them? And he said this, he said, I believe God heard their prayers, but did he hear their screams? The priest wrestles with this question for the whole movie. And after he has witnessed so many of his friends be tortured, persecuted, and after he's been imprisoned himself, he finally asks the question he's been too afraid to ask this whole time. Am I just praying to silence? How do I even know you care, God? Have you forgotten about me? In the midst of doubt and suffering, sickness and death, we all ask that question. Did God forget me? Where am I just praying to silence? But this morning in our passage, I have good news for you. After 400 years of silence between the book of Malachi and the birth of Jesus, God spoke once more to a singular couple, yes, but broadly, he was announcing to the world of the Savior that was to come, who would not only offer us salvation to us, but walk through suffering himself in order to rid the world of suffering forever. God has not forgotten us. Let's jump into our main portion of our text this morning, verses 5 through 7. In the days of Herod, king of Judah, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. So there's this priest named Zechariah who is married to a woman named Elizabeth. And here's a fact about them that we just read. They walked blameless, is what verse 6 says. They were awesome people. They served God, they loved God, they served God's people, but they had no children. Elizabeth was barren and they were old. These God-fearing, God-loving, God-serving people run into serious tragedy. Because back in the first century, this was a huge deal, not being able to have kids. It was a shameful thing to do. It was viewed as punishment from God, like you must have done something wrong if you can't get pregnant. God must be punishing you. If you truly loved God, he wouldn't allow this kind of tragedy in your life. Just to straighten some things out, following Jesus does not mean you will never face trials. Following Jesus does not mean that every sickness in your family will be healed. Following Jesus does not preclude us from the suffering of life. Nowhere in the scriptures are we promised health, wealth, and safety because we follow Jesus. What we are assured of is whatever may come in this life, we have him. So we have this couple who's serving God, loving God. They're blameless and righteous in the sight of God, seemingly doing everything right, and yet they are unable to have children. And if you've ever been there, or if you're there right now, you know that infertility can be a debilitating, crushing reality. As you attempt to get pregnant, you have all this hope, right? Only to find out a month later, nah, didn't work. Okay, well, maybe this month. And again, that test comes back negative. Month after month after month, serving as a constant reminder that what you're dreaming of, the family that the baby you're praying for, is yet again not a reality. And your parents keep asking, when are you going to give us grandbabies? And you have no idea how to answer that question. And you've racked up your Target credit card with all these gifts for all these baby showers for your friends, and yet you're never on the other side of that wrapping paper. Infertility can be a heart-wrenching, heartbreaking, hope-draining, soul-killing reality. And I wonder for Zechariah and Elizabeth, as they try to have children month after month after month, how long do they hold out hope? A year? How long do they keep trying? Maybe 3 years? We know from the text that they're old, so how long do they pray for children? 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Decade after decade, they wait, and decade after decade, they have no children until eventually coming to the sobering realization, I guess it's just not going to happen for us. These are the characters we're introduced to in chapter 1. Unless we get too down in the dumps, like, thanks for bumming us out right as we head into Christmas. Don't forget the main point this morning, that God has not forgotten them. God has not forgotten. Let's keep going. Verse 8. Now, while he was serving, this is Zechariah, was serving as a priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. So we learn in verse 8 that this old childless man was tasked with entering into the temple and performing some religious duties. Let's do a little bit of Bible study here. Zechariah was a priest, which means that he came from the Levite family. And there were a ton of Levites. It's not like there was just a handful. Back in 1 Chronicles chapter 23, there were 24,000 men who were given the role as priests. And the people who served as a priest would be split into 24 divisions. David organized it that way back in 1 Chronicles chapter 24. In verse 5 tells us that Zechariah was in the division of Abijah, which means that generations earlier, there were 1,000 people in this division. So naturally, that number would grow over time. I swear I'm getting somewhere. And each of these divisions that were exploding only served 2 times a year in this way. They would serve a week at a time, and only 2 weeks a year, this particular division of priests would be called on to perform their religious duty. So if you just think about, 2 times a year, there's too many priests to perform this temple task. So what would they do? The passage tells us they cast lots, leave it to chance, or sovereignty of God. And it was chosen that Zechariah gets this chance to enter the temple and burn the incense. And this is a big deal. Every day they would go in and burn the incense, and they would offer up the prayers of the people to God. This was an act so holy, so revered, so honored that if you were cast lots and you were able to go in, you could never do it again. You couldn't do it twice in a lifetime. And the chances of even doing it once are slim to none. This is literally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to stand in the presence of God and pray to God on behalf of God's people. The vast majority of priests never got that opportunity, and the average person would never be able to enter into the temple. But then, one fateful day, Zechariah is given this holy task of entering the temple and praying on behalf of God's people. This is like the highlight of his life. This is what everything has been leading up to. So Zechariah enters the temple, and verse 11 and 12 says, "And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him." And that makes sense. Zechariah enters the temple. He's assuming what's going to happen here. He's doing the duty that he was trained for, and all of a sudden an angel shows up, and he's freaking out. He's like, does this happen to everyone? What's going on here? Nobody told me about the angel part. And the angel speaks in verse 13, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. In your life Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." I want to focus in on that sentence, "Your prayer has been heard." My question is, what prayer? Zechariah was supposed to enter the temple and burn incense for the prayers of the people, not his own personal prayers, right? And I can't say for sure, but maybe, if he's anything like me, Zechariah, leading up to this moment, had an idea. I mean, all his life he longed for children, and month after month after month, Elizabeth was not pregnant. I wonder how many times he prayed to God, asking him to give them a child, and then he gets his lot picked, and he's like, finally, I have a chance to enter into the presence of God and ask him face to face. Maybe he prayed one last time, a Hail Mary last-ditch effort, a prayer he'd been praying for decades but had long since given up on. Maybe as he entered the temple into the very presence of the Lord, he let out one more desperate plea to God, "Bring my wife and I a child." And in that moment, an angel appeared to him to give him some news. "Your prayer has been heard." Can you imagine, after decades of waiting, how sweet those words would sound to you? Whether it was a prayer he prayed right then or the prayers he prayed decades ago, your prayer has been heard and you will have a son. Wow. And in verse 18, we see Zechariah's response. "How shall I know this? For I am an old man and my wife is advanced in years." Zechariah is confronted with the heavenly being and still he doesn't believe. Like, you gotta be honest. If an angel showed up this morning and started talking in our midst, I would tend to believe that thing. Like, I wouldn't just brush it off as nothing. But Zechariah still has doubts, which, on second thought, makes a lot of sense to me. I know many people in this room who've experienced disappointments, who've experienced loss, who've prayed and prayed and prayed and done everything they could, and they kept serving God, and they keep obeying God, and they prayed some more, and still after all that waiting, nothing. And you're left with this feeling of like, God, have you forgotten me? Did you leave me? Are you even listening? And you've been in that spot long enough that you know how hard it is to break yourself out of that hole, because cynicism is a really useful tool against disappointment. Because how many times have people with the best intentions tried to give you a pat on the back in some sort of cliche? Maybe next time. You know, time heals all wounds. When God closes a door, he opens a window. And you just have to shrug it off with a laugh. But every time someone says something like that, it feels like a stab in the stomach. And internally you know it's just not true, because most of the time it's not. Even to the point an angel couldn't convince you. But here's the truth. If you're in that place today, or if you're thinking back to a time you were in that spot, God has not forgotten you. Zechariah's name means God remembers. God remembers. Even during those days, those months, those years where Zechariah and Elizabeth cried out to God and felt like God had left them or ignored them, God remembers. God has not lost sight of Zechariah, and God has not lost sight of you. No matter where you've been, no matter how many prayers seem to go unanswered, no matter how long you've been waiting, God has not lost sight of you. God remembers you, and I know that this morning because he brought you into this old church with this bald-headed dude to tell you that God has not forgotten you. The story's not over. Zechariah's actually struck mute until John is born because of his disbelief, and he communicates through hand gestures, it says in verse 22, that's one epic game of charades, 10 months worth of charades. And we move to verse 24, and we find out that indeed Elizabeth did conceive a son, and his name was John. Okay, this is the gospel of Jesus according to Luke, and yet Luke chooses to start this story about this other baby being born that's not Jesus. That's kind of an odd decision, Luke. Like, I don't understand what's going on here. And what we need to know is that this baby is not just some random miracle from God. He's a fulfillment of prophecy. Back in the book of Malachi 3:1, the Lord said, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me." The Israelites are under hostile Roman occupation. They've been waiting for a prophet for centuries. There's this yearning from Israel for God to finally send the Messiah to save them. And God lets them know, before I come, I will prepare a messenger to prepare the way. And this is who John is. John is the messenger from God who comes to declare that Messiah is on the way, that God had not forgotten his people. God had not fallen down on his promises. God is coming to restore his people. This story represents the announcement of the coming of the King and the assurance that God has not forgotten about his people. It's good news for Zechariah, it's good news for the Israelites of his day, and it's beautiful news for us today that God has not forgotten about us. What a beautiful truth for us to hear this morning, because I know that this morning there are many in this room who are hurting. There's people who are fighting sickness. People mourning the loss of parents and children. There's people who are feeling the oppressive weight of loneliness and depression. The Christmas season is not all lights and presents under the tree for everyone. It's a time of deep grief for some. And I know there's many people in this room who are asking the same kind of things that missionary to Japan was asking. All these prayers, all this waiting, all this longing to be healed, all this needing to be made whole. Like, does God even hear me? And Luke 1 answers the question for us. He does. Although in our sin-sick world everything is broken, God has not forgotten about us. He sees us, he knows us, he hears us, and we take communion every week to remember that he suffered alongside us. We go back to the missionary to Japan who God asks, "Where are you? Why are you so silent?" And at the end of the movie, after having his life and calling stripped away from him, after being tortured, imprisoned, forced to humiliate himself, he prays to God. And finally, in response, he finally hears God say to him, "I was never silent. I was suffering alongside of you." And as he's grappling with this reality, tears well up in his eyes, and he says out loud, "I know." Jesus was born in order to announce a Messiah. John was born in order to announce a Messiah to come, that God would not leave us alone in the silence. And there was much anticipation and speculation about what he would be like. Most envisioned a military or government or political leader who would defeat the Romans by sword, but what they got was a poor traveling preacher who defeated sin, Satan, and death by himself being put to the sword. God has not forgotten about us. In fact, he has suffered alongside of us. God hasn't forgot about us, Citylight. What we celebrate in the Advent season and in Christmas is that God has come to rescue us. In Jesus, God came in flesh and blood, and he walked this earth that he created. He walked this path before us. He walked up the hill of Calvary, suffering alongside of us and suffering in our place. But he didn't just walk us through the road of suffering. He walks us through the valley of the shadow of death as he himself experiences death. But here's the best news. We have a great high priest who has experienced life before us. He's walked through suffering before us and even gone through death before us, but he was also raised from the dead so that all who are in Christ might also experience resurrection life with him. That's what we celebrate at Christmas. Jesus entered into a world of waiting. For thousands of years, God's people had waited for God to send a Savior who would be able to rescue them, to free them from their captivity, to restore peace, put everything back to rights. Jesus came to a world, to a Jewish people who were waiting for a Messiah to make all things new, to renew all that was broken, rebuild all that was destroyed, and restore all that has been lost. And on the cross, God himself bears the sin of the world so that our souls could be renewed, rebuilt, and restored. On the cross, Jesus took the punishment for our sin so that should we turn from our sin and turn to him, we receive his grace and forgiveness in return. And in that, our very souls are redeemed and our relationship with God can be put back together again. But he's not finished. Lest I remind you that this Advent season, we not only celebrate the first coming of Jesus, we look forward to the second Advent. Because on that day when Jesus returns on the clouds in glory, everything will be redeemed. All that is broken will be renewed. All that's destroyed will be rebuilt. All that has been lost will be restored. On the second Advent, we will not only have redemption for our souls, but a restoration of all of creation where he will wipe every tear from our eyes. He will heal every sickness, mend every broken heart, and put an end to our suffering once and for all because he has not forgotten us. He has actually suffered alongside of us. This is the glorious truth of the gospel. That God is now and will one day ultimately renew all that's broken, rebuild all that's destroyed, and restore all that's lost. God is and will mend every broken heart, heal every broken soul, and bring light and life to the dark and desolate things in us. So we take communion every week to remember this truth that he has not forgotten us, that he has actually suffered alongside of us. The bread is his body. It was broken, and the juice is his blood that was shed. He was crucified for us so that we might be able to have forgiveness for our sin and relationship with God. This meal is open for all who love Jesus and want to follow him. And if you aren't a follower of Jesus, man, I invite you to, in your seat, pray to God. Pray to a God you might feel is absent to you and ask him to speak. And I want you to consider the person of Jesus who claimed himself to be God. And like, what better way to let the world know you are there than to actually come and walk alongside of us? And as you ask God to speak and as you look at his son, you'll come to realize that he has spoken through the life, death, and resurrection of his son. And his voice is still calling to you, come to me. Find forgiveness in my grace, life in my death, and freedom in my embrace. And my prayer for you this morning is that you would listen. If you're a follower of Jesus, but you're in a season of silence, you've been crying out to God, but you feel defeated, deflated, or dejected, you are free to come take communion with us, remembering that God himself has walked this earth, lived a perfect life, and died a sinner's death so you might be able to know his presence that has never left you. In the midst of your doubt, in the midst of your struggle, he hasn't promised us that we wouldn't walk through suffering in this life. He has promised us something much greater than that. God is with you and has promised eternal life, free from sin, Satan, to death. In taking communion this morning, we remember Christ coming in the midst of Israel's waiting, and we know that in the midst of ours, he will come again.